Welcome to 100 Days of Trailhead, where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, and invest in ourselves. We are your trail guides, here to support you on your learning journey. We release videos weekly. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video. In the description below, you can find links for everything we mention in this video, as well as books and resources we found useful. Visit our blog, 100daysoftrailhead.com, for other helpful Salesforce and tech content. Many times, clients and organizations want all solutions documented, but where do you start? What does this type of documentation look like? In this video, Roan Bear discusses the best practices and tips on how to create thorough functional documentation for the technology you are delivering. Roan is the principal consultant at Roan Bear Consulting, and she has been loving Salesforce since 2003. Your quest, should you choose to take it, is to journey with us learning how to create spectacular specs. Your quest begins now.
Our speaker is Roan Bear! Woo!
Okay, great. So welcome to Spectacular Specs and How to Write Them. And I'd like to thank the WIT Dev team for this opportunity to do this presentation. I'm honored that all of you chose to attend. And if those of you that are watching the replay, also welcome. So thank you. As you know, my name is Roan Bear. I've been a member of the Ohana before we called it that. I think it's around 2003, might have been 2004. My oldest dev org is dated 2005. And this is my current favorite picture because in it I have my dog Heston, and I always look better in pictures with my dog. But more importantly is I'm wearing my Trailhead DX bandana. And you know, I miss all of you very much. Since 2003 or 4, I've done a ton of solution design. I co-founded a Salesforce ISV company. I've done a lot of product design. And in working with customers, I've written many functional specifications. So, you know, I hope you find this session informative and thought-provoking. So we're going to go over design considerations for writing a functional spec, tools you might use in this process, and how you might structure the document. So what's a functional spec? It's not a technical spec. It doesn't tell the developer how to code the application. For example, define these class names and run these queries. But it is a detailed description of the functionality that's to be built. And it may recommend certain approaches that you would discuss with the dev team down to field level details. It might be used for the business owner to sign off on scope. And in my view, it's a working document. So you're going to see we're going to be talking about this a bit. It's not really finalized until you know, we've completed UAT and it's deployed, because you know, you may need to make revisions as we move along. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of this document, you know, how does this work with Agile? So Agile, and I'm not an Agile expert by far. And if you work in a large enterprise, I've worked with large enterprise customers, but I've never actually been employed in a large enterprise. So this is my impression of it. And I've talked to people about it, and I've worked with teams that are doing it. But it seems to me that it really works best if you have a team where all of the members have domain expertise and they're available for lots of meetings like daily stand-ups. And it's also good as an iterative process if you're not sure what the final output will be. So some of the problems that I've seen with user stories, and specifically, is they might be too high level and they leave the details to the development team. So if you do have a development team without domain expertise, they may not build a solution that takes into consideration all of the other dependencies in the org. So for example, just one time I saw a team create a duplicate of an existing field rather than using what was already there. So sometimes what I've seen is what's missing is really the architect, and this is the person who translates the business requirements into more robust user story. I've been in a lot of companies where they ask the business user to write the user story, and then they code to it. So a functional spec could be a really important part of Agile development methodology. And on the right, you can see more of your traditional waterfall development model. If you know what you want to build already, you can write out the document with everything that you want to build. And it is more work, but as you're going to see in this presentation, I still view it as collaborative. You're not sitting alone in a room writing everything up and just tossing it over the wall. And you could piece this out into bits to fit into Agile methodology. So if you are using Agile and you want to incorporate functional specs into it, my general recommendations would be is to, review the whole scope of the project with the development team and get sizing estimates on what each piece is going to take. And you want to underlie any infrastructure issues that might have to be considered. For example, maybe there's a custom routing engine or asynchronous system that needs to be modified, or maybe some code has to be refactored. Those are things that they would be more aware of than you might be aware of. And then if it does have to span multiple sprints, I would prioritize as follows. I would pull out the pieces in the functional spec that have to do with development infrastructure, and then after that, I would deal with functional pieces that can be broken out to demonstrate and move things to UAT. For example, after key infrastructure pieces that have to be done, I might say, okay, well, let's build the objects in the field next so that we can use dummy data and mock up what this is going to look like, and validate reports for the business users. And then so the basic idea is that if you are going to span multiple sprints, you should still have an idea of the big picture, and indicate clearly in the functional spec what you've pieced out into which sprints. And you might even want to have a sprint schedule or a link to a sprint schedule attached to the document. So one of my favorite sayings, and I have it in a post-it right on my monitor, is YANYA. There's a good talk about this, but essentially you are not your audience. Don't write this document for yourself. You have to think about who's going to be consuming and interacting with the document, right? So you want to think about what they know, how they consume information, maybe what their learning style is. And this will drive the level of detail that you need to provide in the functional spec. So for example, for the business owner, do they use Salesforce? Can they do testing and validation? Would they actually be referencing this document when they're doing QA, if they're the user that's actually going to want to test it? For the developer, are they a contractor or are they internal in part of your team? Do they actually use the UI? I've known developers that have never created an opportunity through the UI. They only did it programmatically. Developers, they can use this document as the basis for what they're building, and the QA scenarios that you write out might be used to document bugs or highlight missing unit tests. So this document ends up being a type of documentation that you can reference after the fact. QA and UAT, is this a specific person? Is this a team? Is this internal, external? The QA scenarios that you write should be written to support the audience that's actually going to be doing the testing. And then you have your admin. This is the person that's going to be maintaining the code after you've completed the project. And they need to really understand what you've built into the solution and how any changes they make in the future might impact the code. So these are some of the tools you might use in writing a functional spec. One of them is you might use a template. So especially if you work for a consulting firm, or if your company already has process established, you might have a nice template that you use already. I tend to work in Google Docs, and I don't care that much about how pretty my document is, but I think it can add some professionalism, and that can never hurt. Because I view these documents as collaborative, I want to have it documented in a collaborative environment. As I said, I like Google Docs, but there's lots of other solutions where people can comment, give feedback, and you can work together to build a more comprehensive solution. I also will use a diagramming tool. Currently, I'm enjoying Glyphy, but there's lots of solutions out there. Diagramming tools are really good to explain complicated situations, it's really a good way to explain to the business owner what the application is actually going to do. That's not text heavy. And it's also good for reviewing with the developers. And it's also good for your own process in building out the functional spec, because a lot of times when you're building out a diagram, it helps expose gaps in your logic and things you might have missed. So for larger projects, you might build a high-level diagram, and then you might have detailed views that drill into specific functionality. And then, you know, some of these diagrams you're actually going to start working on in part of the discovery process, so that you can validate with the business user, this is how the data is going to flow, this is what the choices are and the outcomes are. So you've already, hopefully you've started working on this before you've gotten to actually writing up the functional spec. Also, I've got a couple other resources here, which is the Salesforce object reference. And I've also added the order of execution, but you know, sometimes when you're doing a solution, you might actually go in and check. How does this object work? What's the field name? You know, one of the things you're going to see is that in a functional spec, oftentimes I'll use the API names of fields. So that's a good way to look and get the API names of standard fields or validate relationships. So on the right, you can see we're going to grab a template. We're going to fill in the details. We're going to create some diagrams. We're going to check with the business owner. So this is before we've written this functional spec. And or maybe we're starting to work on it. And if they're good with it, if they're not good with it, you're going to revise it. But then we come up to the developer here. We review with them. We build, we QA, we UAT, we deploy. But what it really looks like is when we review with the dev team, we're going to look for feedback from the dev team. And that might actually send it back to the business owner, in which case we're looping back here again. Or if it doesn't actually impact the business owner, then we can go into build and QA, but UAT might introduce another cycle of modifications to the document. I like to start out functional specs with a business overview. So, you know, we want to talk about what the business challenges are and how the functionality solves the problem and any specific nuances that they might want to consider. And it does a couple of things. First of all, it demonstrates to your audience, your business case owners, that you understand the requirements, you understand the issue. And it also creates a defined scope for the project because they're going to agree with you, so it helps with scope creep, right? And you've documented what you're going to build. More importantly, for me, is it also provides a context for the developer. So if you're working with a good developer, they won't just code, they're going to think, right? And they'll recommend improvements to the functional spec and question you if something was overlooked or doesn't make sense. So the product, whatever project you're building, it's always going to be better when the whole team is thinking critically about it. So this section is very important for the developer because otherwise they'd be working in a vacuum and not be able to think critically about what they're building and what the business context is for the solution. So for this reason, I do emphasize that developers read this section. So here's an example of a very simplified business overview, right? In order to support WitDev's Inc.'s sales process, key stakeholders must be identified before an opportunity stage can progress. Stakeholders are to be added as opportunity contact roles and given the appropriate label. Sales reps are not complying with this requirement because it involves more clicks. Oh no! So we're going to require that they identify stakeholders based on the opportunity stage they want to set by presenting them with a validation alert. The rep will not be able to update the stage and will have to add the stakeholders before doing so. This will result in compliance with WitDev Inc.'s sales process. This will produce better opportunity data and ensure correct stakeholders are identified in order to close more deals faster. So the next section is the development overview. So this is where I like to talk about, okay, where are we going to build this? How are we going to do this? So In the old days, it was build in this sandbox. Now we have source control and, Scratch org. So you might step back from, you might just not need to define this because your organization or your customer is sophisticated enough that they have this process established already. But if the organization still is using sandboxes, this would be a good place to define, describe where they're going to build and identify any dependencies. Does something need to be, does a third-party package need to be installed and configured? Does certain data need to exist? And then you're going to talk about the general approach to use. So is this going to be done in a batch? Is this a trigger? We want to think about extensibility, and do we need to be able to fire this on demand? And then we'll also talk about key concepts and nuances related to code. So what might they not know about the data model from the end user's perspective that might inform how they go about programming? And then, for contractors, I wouldn't do this to your inside team, but this is a really important place to highlight your expectations of best practices. The one trigger rules them all, right? Don't put your code in a trigger. Your code needs to be bulk safe. You need to comment the code, and we want real unit tests with sufficient code coverage. Now, why am I saying this? Because I've seen lots of projects not comply with these things. So I just go ahead and put it out there so that they can be held accountable when it doesn't meet that criteria. Of course, nobody in this room would do that, but we're just looking out for ourselves, or we're looking out for our customer. So here's an example of a development overview, right? The code will be built in the pre-staging sandbox. The ABC app must be installed and configured. Code will be written as an opportunity trigger when the opportunity stage is changed before update. Please do not write the code in the trigger. Use the existing opportunity trigger called opportunity trigger to call the new classes that you will write. Code must be bulk safe, commented, and have 95% code coverage. Unit tests should run real tests, have system assert statements that run actual tests. So this would be an example of a concept that I want to explain to them, because again, they're in the code, they're not in the front end, they're not creating opportunities every day. So I'll want to explain the concept of stakeholders to them. So I'll say stakeholders. This is the evaluation of the existing opportunity contact role records related to the opportunity and the value of the role field. Each opportunity stage, and you can see here I've highlighted opportunity.stage name. So I've used dot notation to indicate exactly what field we're talking about. I'm trying to make this really concrete to make it easy for the developer to see exactly what I'm talking about. Because we'll require one or more opportunity contact role, dot role records that will be referenced in a custom metadata type or custom setting. So I'm going to explain to them that you can have the same contact related to the opportunity as different opportunity contact roles down below. And I'm going to ask them, I'm going to tell them that we're going to map these dependencies in a custom metadata type or custom setting. And I'm going to highlight in red here are some other comments, say, come back and fill in what you built here, right? Developers, please review and insert below the name and the tactic used. So maybe they decided it's going to be a custom metadata type, and this is what we're going to call it, and this is how I built it, and this is the approach we took, right? Because I don't know what they're going to code. I don't know what they're going to end up doing from a development perspective, but I want to capture it here so that everything will be in one document.
Roan, we have a question. The question was, so do you expect your BAs to know this much about what a developer might need, like basically the more technical aspects, or what are the expectations?
So there might be a handoff. It depends on your organizational structure, right? So for example, in our company, Full Circle Insights, sometimes myself or somebody else more experienced would come in and write the functional spec, and the general business requirements might be gathered by a BA, right? So sometimes there's a handoff. I am thinking of this in a technical perspective. It's a functional specification, so it's a step beyond the user story. So I think if you're in the org and you're designing a solution, you're going to have to validate your solution before you hand it off to developers. So for example, you might go and in a dev org create let's say you're building a new object. You might create a dummy object in a dev org and see if you can generate the reports you need before you tell the dev team to go build it, right? So I think it's good to understand things like API names. Some of the things that I'm saying here sound really fancy, but I'm not a developer yet, right? I've talked to developers, so I've sat on sessions about good code. So saying something like everything needs to be bulk safe, you can take that from this session here today and just put that in your documents. You don't have to know how they go about doing that, but you can set the expectation, right? So learning a little bit about best practices in code is really important, because I've, over the years, seen a lot of orgs blow up when things weren't built bulk safe, right? And granted, when I started, it was more of a Wild West out there. And now I think more developers are learning better practices, but this is self-defense that I think is good to know. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about this if they want more background on it. But if you're working in Salesforce and you're defining fields, or you know that they're building fields, you should know what an API name is on the field. Happy to show that to you too. It's super easy. Was that helpful?
Yeah, they said
yes. Okay, good. Okay, great. So, and sometimes I talk to a developer and I get their feedback on things before I finish writing it. Like sometimes you're working with them before you write up this document and say, this is what I'm thinking, is this possible? And let's say, well, actually it isn't, or try it this way. So there's no rule that says that you can't talk to them before this document's done. But what you want to do is validate that what you're asking them to build is actually possible. You don't want to find out that it doesn't work before that it doesn't work when you go to have them build it, right? Then you've wasted everybody's time. So one of my best stories was way back when I was starting. I did this great big solution and I did everything except I didn't do the page layouts, and I didn't realize that the lead status couldn't be removed from lead page layouts. And my whole design was around using a different field and not using the lead status, right? So at the last minute, we had to refactor everything to reference the lead status field because it couldn't come off of the page layout. So, it's good to try these things. Make sure what you're handing off can really work. And of course, best practice with Salesforce is, for a lot of these solutions to start with reporting, can you measure it, that it worked? Can you measure that you're accomplishing what you need? Okay, great. So another thing we might do is we might specify what the alert's going to be. So again, we're back into concepts. So alert, we want this to be a validation alert on the page, either as a pop-up or next to the opportunity stage field, so the user can save the opportunity without the stage update, and they'll not lose their changes that they've made. And we'd like to dynamically populate the alert message. So here I'm just saying, this is the content we want. And this is something I might have talked to the business owner about, right? You can't progress the opportunity stage and then dynamically populate the stage value until you've added the following stakeholders. And then here would be the rules, the missing rule names that are missing. And then I might ask them, what's your recommendation for a classic and lightning experience that would work best here? The developer at this point might say to me, we could have a pop-up with the available contacts and just prompt them to add a contact role then and there. And then, or if you haven't discussed that with the business owner, you could go back to the business owner, or you could say, yeah, we talked about that, but it's, too expensive in terms of time and resources. So we're just going to go just easy with a validation alert right now. Great.
We've got another quick
Sure.
question. So what about running through a walkthrough before it's officially sent as done with a developer?
We may see something not thought of.
So they're saying that they might, you might come up with something that you haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, so we are gonna go through this with the developer and get their feedback on the document, right? So I think that's what you're asking me is like, when do you go through this with the developer? So after you've written the document, you're going to present a document with these types of questions, and you will review it with the developer. And there might be things that they go off and they research and they look at and they come back to you with recommendations. But you have to get something down to have the conversation, right? Did that answer the question?
It looks like it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So the next thing we're going to talk about is diagramming, and you'll remember that we talked about working on these as soon as possible, getting a high-level diagram to the business owner just so that they can say, yeah, this is what I'm expecting it to do. Super helpful for you because that's where you find the gaps, right? So you're writing this functional specification, and when you have to have yes and no routes, it really makes you think about what you haven't thought about. It's not, many times they go back and you say, hey, I hadn't thought about this use case. What do you want to have happen here? So we'll actually have another session to like look at the gaps after the initial, business discovery. And these diagrams can include pre-processed stuff, like how they first created an opportunity or what they did after the code runs. So it doesn't just have to be the code in a vacuum. You might provide some context in it. But I like working on it as soon as possible. So the other thing that's important to think about in your functional design is extensibility, right? So it's best not to hard code things that might need to be updated over time. For example, user IDs, role names, campaign IDs, time frames. So it's good to add a configurability to your design, and you might call that out, in your description of the functional spec. So there's a couple ways that this is, easily accomplished. One of them is custom metadata types or custom settings. Another would be permission sets. So typically, I like to let the developer decide how they'd like to approach it, as long as I've identified to them what's configurable, and then document their approach so that we'll know exactly what they built. Custom metadata types have, the added advantage that they can be deployed with change sets if you're still using change sets. But you want to keep in mind any IDs that you've put into a sandbox might need to be updated in production. So that would go into your deployment steps document. So as you're writing this document and you're thinking about this, you're keeping notes going, remember to change out this ID when you deploy. So you're a little bit all over the document as you're building it to make sure you don't lose little details like that. You might want to build an on and off switch for this. It's actually best practices in Apex code as introduced in Advanced Apex Programming by Dan Appelman, but not all people follow best practices. So also, if the organization already has global on and off switches, disable all triggers and stuff like that, you would want to make sure that that's included in this project. You might want to, tag certain records. Maybe there's records that don't meet the general criteria, but there's one-offs that you want them still to be processed. So you might have a checkbox field as a way to extend beyond, say, opportunity types. And that could be a checkbox or a checkbox formula field. And then you might want to also build some auditing into your solution. So for example, let's say some update runs on opportunities once a week. You might want to date timestamp the last time it ran on that opportunity so you could see whether or not it didn't get updated or when the update happened. It just helps you troubleshoot. So kind of thinking about those things. So this would be an example of extensibility. So which opportunities are we going to, fire on? So we're going to we're going to work on opportunities where the type equals new business. And we're also going to have an opportunity field, a required stakeholder checkbox that's true. So this will be our general type equals new business is kind of catches all opportunities. And this little checkbox field is going to be our one-offs. And we're going to build this as a formula field that our sysadmin is going to maintain. And we're going to say, well, the other thing always to think about is which users bypass this requirement of a stakeholder, right? Always build an out. There's always going to be somebody that's going to still need to get beyond that code. So without wanting to necessarily turn it off for the whole org. So in this case, we've discovered that admins and finance users can change opportunity stages without having the required stakeholders. And then also consider, if there's any integration users, if you have any applications that are updating opportunities that could hit this trigger, you would want to be able to bypass them. So it's like, how do you want to approach this? Well, do you want to create a checkbox on the user record? That would work if you're a really small company. Otherwise, maybe you would have a configuration that defines roles or profiles, or perhaps a permission set that gets checked. And then, the last thing you want to think about in your functional design is you want to think about efficiency, right? So if anything you're building, and this is again something that you can talk to with the development team, like make a friend on the dev team. I've had lots of conversations with them when I was trying to understand this. Is one of the things that's really challenging for Salesforce orgs, especially as they get larger, is CPU, right? Things will just die a horrible death because too many things are processing. In particular, the emphasis on declarative and process builders in particularly really brought down a lot of orgs. So what can happen with the order of execution is triggers can run, which can fire declarative, which can then fire triggers, which can fire declarative. So you can end up just consuming all of the time for the transaction, and it just never happens. So my recommendation is, if you're building, if you're writing out a functional design, a functional specification, and especially if you're kind of an admin and you do declarative stuff, it's really tempting to say, well, I can do this one thing with a workflow rule, or I can do this one with a process builder or an after save flow. I'm just going to build it that way so the developers have less to code. But really, if you want to keep the org efficient and streamlined, if you're already writing Apex, keep it in Apex. That's going to be the fastest, most efficient CPU consumption approach on the platform. And if you already have declarative code that's operating on the same object that can be rolled into the code, consider just pulling everything in and getting rid of declarative when you already have Apex. And that's my personal opinion about it. Other people might disagree, but I've been in CPU hell for a long time. So I'm kind of ready for that situation to go away. So so here we would say, okay, code execution, if it's a trigger, you can indicate here. By trigger, we mean that something specific happens on a record, and this code should execute for that record. You may have to set up as asynchronous, which means there's a delay. So again, in talking to your developer, they might say, oh, we got too much stuff happening on opportunities. We can't do it immediately. For our particular story, I would say, well, it has to happen immediately because the sales rep is trying to change the stage. We have to create an alert for them. But in other cases, we might be able to say, oh, it's fine if that happens in a few seconds delay. It can be asynchronous. It doesn't have to happen immediately. So you want to think about the context of the org, and this is where your developers will have a lot of input if they're internal, just because they're already probably dealing with some pain points around if they're built up around what's already happening on certain objects and where there's room to build more stuff and where we kind of need to refactor things. You might also consider batch code, which you can just schedule to run once a day or every 15 minutes or once a week. So maybe these are updates that you do, but it doesn't have to be immediate. Batch code is extremely efficient. You want to think about things like ordering your records. So if you're processing a bunch of opportunities, do we want to do oldest to newest? Do we want that to be based on the created date or the last modified date? Think about things like that. And tiebreakers. What if you have two records that are the same? Which one do you choose? And then what I like to do, especially if we're doing something, if you're running a batch, is you might also in the functional spec ask for a code that you can run at the developer console that will process a set of records in real time rather than waiting for the scheduled batch to run. So this would be, here is an example of code that I can stick in the developer console, and I can replace my, in between these single quotation marks, I can replace this with opportunity IDs, and it will run those opportunities for me immediately. And so that's useful if you have specific records that don't match the general batch criteria. Let's say you're only going 60 days back and you have a few stragglers that are from 90 days ago that you want to process, or you're doing QA and you don't want to wait for the batch to run, so you can just run them through this code snippet to simulate running the code. So that's a deliverable that I'll, if I'm doing anything in batch, that I'll ask for from the development team in the functional spec, and I'll ask them to come back and document how do we run that. So this would be an example. Code should be written as an opportunity trigger when the opportunity stages change before update. Use the existing opportunity trigger, or call to call the class. Developer, please indicate the class name and test class name below. So think about also in your functional specification, think about records. So you want to document which records are subject to the functionality. Are there exceptions? And be careful with your language. Developers might think an exception, they'll think apex exceptions, and they'll hear functionality that triggers the code. They'll hear trigger, not the verb, but rather the noun. So you want to just be careful that you're clear with your language. You know, is there an on and off switch? So we want to think about adding these things. So an example of this would be, you know, the code applies to opportunities that require stakeholder. So if, I'm not crazy about this slide, by the way, this is my least favorite slide in here. So if one is true, so the running user stakeholder bypass field isn't set. So we're not saying this person doesn't need a stakeholder. And one of these is true. Either the opportunity type that we configured matches our metadata type that we're going to enter here, or the stakeholder required checkbox is true. So that's going to be kind of our example of the criteria for which we will trigger on these. These are the records that are eligible for this functionality. You might have a section on global settings. So this is where you're defining what you've decided your extensibility is going to be here. So you'll talk about custom metadata types or custom settings. You might actually, sometimes I go and I build the fields. I might even build the custom metadata type if I know what I want it to be, or I'll just define it in the document. And the question is, why wouldn't you just let the developer do that? Well, you certainly can, but sometimes developers build things with names that make sense to them, but aren't user-friendly for the end user. So if you want to have clarity in naming conventions, then you can also go in here and you can tell them what to call things so that it maps to the business logic. And again, the developer should indicate what they've built. So what I like to do in here is I like to talk about, I like to make sure that I'm providing a help text and a description text, and I might provide the initial values to set. So this is a global setting called eligible opportunities, and again, they're going to decide how they're building it. And the label, there'll be a label, and we'll start with default. And this is going to be one of the fields that'll be called opportunity type, and we're going to say what kind of field it is, and we'll have help text describing it. So again, you might not go into this level of detail. I do because I know what I want to have built. So Another one would be the opportunity stakeholder. So here, in here, in this, we might have the field label that's required because it's a standard field, but the code's not going to actually look at this field. One of the reasons that I might not have them look at the label field is it's limited to 40 characters. And if my content might potentially be more than 40 characters, then it'll kill my ability to use that field as a setting. So that's just something that I suffered through because we built, I think in those days it was a custom setting. We referenced the label, and then we had a label that was too long. It didn't fit into, it was too long for the field. So we had to refactor everything into another field. So that's just one of those little things you put in your back pocket that you've learned over time. But we'll look at a field called stage name, and I'm also going to say, hey, this is a unique value, don't allow duplicates, and then indicate, how they provided the validation for that. So this would be the initial data that we're going to fill into our custom metadata type, right? These are going to be my stage names, and these would be the roles, the opportunity roles, and they're semicolon delimited that are going to match to our settings. And I've gotten this data from my business discovery process, or I've gotten it handed to me from a business analyst. So this is what we're going to actually build, right? We're going to build these records. And you can see what's missing here is stage one, because you can create an opportunity without needing a stakeholder / opportunity contact rule. And you can go directly to closed lost without needing a stakeholder either. So it's not every single stage. And so we've talked about the overall design approach and the concepts and the fields and the global settings. So let's get into what we should actually do. You might have more, now you're going to say, okay, this is what I want it to do. And you might have more than one of these sections. If you're building a large specification, you might break it out by different functional areas rather than having it be a big, long dialogue. But, so one could be titled, for example, create renewal opportunity, and another one could be titled, create quote, right? So depending on what you're doing, you can break down the functionality. And here you're going to change your flow chart into a numbered flow chart, and you're going to use text to describe the flow chart, reference API names, and identify dynamic elements and things like tiebreaker rules. So you can see that our high-level diagram has now turned into a more detailed diagram that has numbers that are referenced. And again, you might have multiples of these. So a functional specification, I didn't write the whole thing out, but it would be like opportunity is updated, opportunity type matches the global setting eligible opportunities. If so, if it does, then go to 3. If it doesn't, then you're done, right? So we're going to walk through and describe it in text. So some people do much better looking at this text, and some people do much better with the visuals. So you've provided both ways to digest complex information. So the next section we're going to talk about is, I'm going to speed up because I see I'm running short on time. How much time do I have, guys?
You're fine.
You're totally fine.
I'm okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're
I had a slide. Okay. So
we'd rather you go through the content and people get the information.
yes.
Okay, well, I hope I'm not talking too fast. So my functional specifications include a QA section, believe it or not. Why is that? Because when I'm writing out QA scenarios, it helps me notice if I missed anything. But I'm going to admit that I have had my dev meetings before I finished my QA scenarios. It's bad. They're really painful to write. You have to think about the audience that's going to be doing QA, right? And you're going to want to do one round of testing yourself before you hand it off to the QA team. I always kind of validate that they built what I thought before, we throw it full in if I can. And again, this is a place for me to see if I missed something. And the level of detail that you write in is going to depend on your audience. So in QA testing, I oftentimes have introductions. I don't just jump into scenarios. So I might say, hey, this is how you test things. And at that point, if we were doing a batch and we had a code snippet, I would discuss the batch and the code snippet and say, this is how you do it. This is how you populate the opportunity IDs. And in that case, I want to think, well, is my audience, do they even know what the dev console is? Do they have permission to access it? Do they need instructions on how to use it? So I have to think about that, right? Let's see. Okay, so you might have some, you might also have some reusable, if you're writing multiple functional tests, this is a place where you've already written up how to use the dev console, so you can just copy and paste and throw it back in here, right? So if you have a template, maybe that's something that stays in your template that you can just delete out. So the next section I'll often talk about is data setup. Because when you're doing testing, you need to have your data set up just so. Like in our story here, we need to have an opportunity, and that's already created. So, for example, if you're going to create an opportunity, what fields need to be set on it, right? Does it require any related records? So this section helps the end user understand how to set up the data for testing, so you don't have to repeat that description within each scenario. And you might want to provide instructions for creating any records and review any required fields, right? So I don't know about you guys, but if you've done consulting, a lot of times you go into somebody's org and you're just trying to change the opportunity stage, and a whole bunch of other things are required. So it's a huge waste of time trying to figure out what it is you have to do. And it's really nice if you just say, okay, populate these 3 fields, add this dependent record, and then you can change the stage. And from an API, from a development perspective, it's good also to include API names, so that helps the developer when they're writing unit tests to know that they have to have these certain fields, these certain required fields. They don't have to learn the hard way either when their unit tests fail, right? And then you can think about, are we testing as a different user? In which case, you might need to provide instructions on how to log in as a different user. So, so think about who's testing and what kind of support they need. And then I like to, if you did build any global settings, again, we're now in a QA section. So we talked about building these global settings in the development section, which your QA people might not have reviewed, or your business user just skips over that stuff there, but they want to test. So here you can go ahead and review. This is what we built, and this is how you access it, and this is the actual data, so we're going to test against it, right? So if you're changing to negotiation and review, these are the ones that are going to be required for that stage. So it just makes it nice to just show them kind of, this is where we're referencing our QA scenarios.
We also had a member that wanted to comment, QA also needs to act like a user and do things in unexpected ways. If I design something and test it in the way it was designed, sometimes things are missed. When a user acts like, the user, then they might find ways that
yeah, absolutely. So that's actually on this slide. It says try to break it.
Yep.
So you want to break it. And the reason you want to try to break it is because you want to find it before it's live in production, right? So I always say I'm a good QA person because I always break stuff. It's like I'm really stupid about my testing. I do all kinds of wacky things. So when you're writing out your test scenarios, you want to number them so it's easy to reference. It's my last bullet here, but honestly, your QA section might be longer than the whole functional specification sometimes. You also, you might even bring in snippets of the flow. If it's really a complicated build, you might bring in that part of the flow chart that you're testing. And you want to have positive and negative tests. So you want to have tests that don't fire the code, and you want to have tests that do fire the code. And I like starting with a brain dump. So I'm going to write these QA scenarios. It's my least favorite part of a functional specification because it's very detailed. You just have to like get into the zone or drink a lot of coffee or something. So I always start with a brain dump and I just kind of spew out onto a piece of page all the things I want to make sure I cover. And sometimes I've thrown notes down there as I'm actually doing the flow charts and writing things down when I go, oh yeah, I got to test this. Oh yeah, I got to test that. So in your QA scenario is going to have what data point are we starting at, what action are you going to take, what's your outcome, and what's your result. I've seen a lot of these in Excel spreadsheets, and sometimes I feel like they're not. That's also a hard way to test, depending on your user. So sometimes I tend to write them out in the Google Doc, and then I can translate them to a spreadsheet if the team prefers testing that way. But a Google Doc is nice because I can have screenshots and I can show them what I expect. And if I see a bug or a bad result, I can screenshot, shot, and throw it down there. So these would be examples of my brain dump, right? It shouldn't fire for new opportunity. It shouldn't fire if it's created as closed won. It shouldn't fire on ineligible opportunities. It shouldn't fire on a user that gets bypassed. It shouldn't fire on an opportunity update without a stage change. Excuse me. I should be able to delete opportunity contact roles. And it should fire on all of the ways it should fire. So I would add those in, right? I would write scenarios for all of the different things we're going to do within reason. So here's my test example, right? A positive test for the stage qualification. So I'm going to run as this user. I'm going to go to this account. I'll select a contact, and from the contact, I'll create an opportunity. So all of this information up here might have been just in the data setup, potentially, right? So I might not need to repeat it here, depending on how you presented them with this global setup, your opportunity. I'm going to update the stage to qualification and save, and this is the error I expect to see. And I might make some notes here. This is what I actually saw. It passed, it didn't pass. This was the problem we had. That's QA. I've kept notes on deployment steps, depending on how you're deploying. So I'm going to be old school here with change sets. I'll be working on this. So I'll want to pre-deployment, I'll want to check and see do we have any opportunities that are missing data. Like maybe there's opportunities there that don't have a type field on them. Therefore, they would go right between, they would bypass this code altogether, right? So is our data solid? Do we need to do any data adjustments before we go live with this? I might write down the order in which first deploy the change set, then adjust field level visibility, then adjust page layouts. We're going to do maybe some check reports to check it. And then, afterwards, do we schedule a batch? How are we going to monitor it? So I'll have these steps kind of built out because it's much easier to build this out when you're building this document than trying to go back and review a document and remember all of the parts. So I strongly recommend that you also view this as part of a functional specification. And then I'm also going to write out admin notes. So what does a consideration does the admin have to keep in mind to maintain this code? For example, if they change the opportunity stage, that has implications, right? They need to know to update the custom metadata records. If we're using that formula field in the opportunity and they need to know where it is and how to adjust it and what it's doing, or if they're creating a new finance user, they might need to check the user bypass field for them. And here's the reports that you can use to monitor the data, and here's how you go about monitoring the code to make sure there aren't any issues. So I'll want to persist, be able to persist support for this code and make sure that there's a good handoff of information. And that's it. Heston took this picture for me today. And if you have any questions, so I just want to thank you.
With that, Roan Bear! Woo!
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Yes.
That was phenomenal.
Yeah, this was great.
That was
okay.
great.
Thank you very much. That was great.
And with that, we're at the end. We hope Roan's tips were helpful to you. If you have an additional tip for building great documentation, or you want to share a topic you would like for us to cover in the future, comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you've stayed with us, here's a bonus. Take the trail on Trailhead called Create a Functional Specification Document. Thank you for spending time with us. Please like and subscribe to our channel because we share weekly content to support your tech and Salesforce learning journey. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss a new video. We also handpick these videos which we recommend you watch next. Connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and on 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.